This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Hi, I'm Dean Gation, and this is the Powerful Connections Podcast. Welcome to Season 2. For many years, my efforts as a service provider were focused on developing, planning, and building high-voltage projects. Whether it is transmission lines, substations, distribution systems, or connecting generation, projects with my involvement have been successful. My company, DGG5 Advising, is the opportunity maker you need for your energy and construction projects. This season, my guests and I will focus on specific topics of interest and bring them to light in interesting discussions. On this episode, we will discuss the culture in the high-risk sector. My guest today is a longtime friend, Andy Kerr. He is one of the best subject matter experts I know in health and safety. He is by nature very giving of his time to transfer knowledge, teach what he knows, and is one of the best coaches and mentors. And he is one of the shining stars I know in the utility world. So please welcome to Powerful Connections, Andy Kerr. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Dean. I'm excited about our opportunity today.
Thanks. I think it's going to be good. So please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. As Dean said, my name's Andy Kerr. I'm a Director of Health, Safety, and Environment for ALECTRA Utilities. I live down in the Waterloo region in Ontario. Grew up in a small town on south end of Georgian Bay, a little town called Meaford. I've worked in the utility industry my entire adult career, starting out in line clearing and then moving over to the line trade, moving down from Owen Sound to Cambridge. I carry a designation both in utility arboriculture and the power line technician. And I got involved in health and safety from an argument. You know, a lot of years ago, back in the late 90s, there was an argument about cotton clothing versus FR versus arc flash. So my career path has been basically the start of an argument to figure out this hazard called arc flash and how we protect the humans from arc flash. So if I've never thanked that individual who we had this argument about, I'd like to thank him because it's definitely shaped my career. You know, I've been involved in electrical safety in the utility environment. Back in 2000 to 2001, we wrote the first arc flash risk assessment for utility workers. And shortly after that assessment, Dean, what happened was a lot of the utilities in Ontario were calling me up and they're like, listen, can you come in and give us a hand, help us understand, you know, why you guys have gone away from, you know, cotton clothing and arc flash and you've moved to arc rated gear, arc rated, clothing and because often the collective agreements in a lot of utilities, they negotiated work clothing, and then work clothing moved from essentially work clothing to personal protective equipment. After we did that risk assessment, started working with some of the utilities and the Safety Association, the Electric Utility Safety Association, was paying close attention to what we were doing because when I was engaging the legacy USA and industry experts, no one really had great answers dealing with the whole arc flash hazard and doing assessments and clothing and where do we start and where do we end. So I ended up going to work after that risk assessment for that utility to legacy USA, which is a legacy Electrical Utility Safety Association. And they allowed me to kind of take my craft nationally, internationally. So I ended up traveling all over Canada and across Ontario and eventually to international platforms talking about electrical safety, particularly focusing on arc flash hazards. And in that involvement or in that process, I actually started to work on standard development. So working with CSA standards such as CSA Z462, Working Live Committee, the TC78 Committee. So I got heavily involved in standards. And then I also, which kind of led me into getting heavily involved into the provincial rulebook or the Electrical Utility Safety Rulebook and becoming the chair of the rulebook. And basically what that means is I was refereeing a lot of disagreements in the interpretation, the application of the rulebook for the province of Ontario between regulators, utilities, the Ministry of Labour, our regulator. Working for the Legacy Electric Utility Safety Association, and a lot of pride in the health and safety, particularly electrical safety. In fact, they were the only safety association that has a rule book embedded in legislation. That rule book's been around a long time, and Dean will probably talk about it more depth. There were very good people at the Safety Association that believed in what I was talking about, and they knew that it was going to be a challenge, to get a better understanding around electrical hazards, particularly dealing with arc flash. To this day, I want to thank some of those guys, the guys like Ted Vandevis, Rick Stahlbaum, a few of the other executives that worked in that legacy organization were really passionate about transferring knowledge and getting the information across to the industry. Talking about saving lives. I've been involved with that for many years. I stayed involved with the provincial rule book, the Electric Utility Safety Rule Book, for all the time that I had worked in the Safety Association. And after about 19, almost 20 years traveling, doing training and consulting across Ontario, different utilities, and across Canada, I decided I better get off the road and hang up my my duffel bag out of the back of the truck and living in hotels to come back to the utilities, because being a trainer and consultant, being able to apply what you've learned and your knowledge into the workplaces, it's a different animal altogether. So I accepted a role the end of 2017 back into the utility industry, and I ended up working at ALECTRA. So I've been at ALECTRA since 2020, during the heart of COVID, which is a whole different conversation that we can talk about at a later time. And I've been at ALECTRA Utilities in a director capacity here, so I look after the health and safety and the environmental team since 2020. Just to kind of tie into some of the other aspects of that, Dean, I've investigated many fatalities directly on behalf of employers, working with joint health and safety committee members on fatalities, on critical injuries, on incidents that have occurred around electrical. I've worked on both sides of the fence. I've worked with the employers, I've worked with the regulator to get to the bottom, to peel back the onion and figure out what truly was going on. It wears you out over time when you're the guy that's helping write the rules for the province, and you go out and you end up investigating critical injuries and incidents and humans getting hurt, and you go, 99% are not a rule problem. It's not a rule book issue. Often it's that human behavior, and it's some of the stuff that revolves around those things. So that's kind of, that's a little bit of my background, Dean.
Thank you very much, Andy. You've had a great career to date, and I know there's lots to do yet. This also brings back a lot of great memories of things we did with creation of all the things that are going on. I remember back as far as even Chuck Talon and the Provincial Labor Management Committee, and then we had Ted Vandevis, and it brings back the thought of the human factor is the hardest and most difficult thing to deal with. So give us a little quick review of ALECTRA for the listeners, please, who they are.
ALECTRA Utilities is a very large municipally owned utility. It's probably the largest one in Canada, municipally owned. And it's the combination of 5 legacy medium-sized utilities from in and around the Greater Toronto area. So Legacy Horizon, which is Hamilton, Stoney Creek, St. Catharines. It's the old EnerSource, which is Mississauga, Brampton Hydro 1, the Legacy Power Stream, which Richmond Hill, Markham, Vaughan, Barrie, all the way up to Penetang, and also Guelph. Guelph is incorporated into there. We've got a large service territory. It's just under 2,000 square kilometers of territory. We've got about 1 million customers and approximately 1,500, it's a little over 1,500 employees. Our distribution asset is 44,000 volt primary, 27.6, 13.8, all the way down to secondary to the connection point to our customers. It's a large organization. It's got a number of different, we actually exercise all of the different work methods in the high voltage industry, from rubber glove techniques to 36,000 volts to bare hand techniques to live line tool techniques. And we do much of that through the apprenticeship and bringing in highly skilled trainers to the organization. And we have a really incredible group of tradespeople that embrace the trade. The culture we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the podcast, but the culture of the utilities at ALECTRA is really fundamentally based on those legacy organizations. They were small, medium-sized utilities, and they really did a very good job taking care of the humans. They cared about one another, and they cared about doing a good job. This organization, from the trades all the way through to management, to the union, have a strong commitment from taking care of their employees. So that's a little bit about ALECTRA.
Thanks very much for that. Andy, we've been involved in many things over the years in trades training and health and safety management systems, supervisory training, leadership concepts, the EUSR, work protection, safe work practices, risk assessments, and hazard recognition. And we've always delivered that safety thinking with workplace inspections, regulations, and requirements. And, our good friend Mike Doherty always promotes and coaches people on quality tier boards and quality inspections, but we're always pushing for workers and supervisors to be present. And we ask them the starter questions, where's the first aid kit? Where's the AED? So there's incident reporting processes for things that happen and need investigation. But today I want to focus on something that is not written in regulations and is not really a requirement, but it's communications of things that happen that no one wants to talk about. So getting an electrical shock and not telling anyone. So the thing no one wants to talk about.
Dean, you've described culture in the high-risk sector. It's culture fundamentally.
All right. So we need to talk about what is culture. Let's start there.
Everybody has health and safety manuals, and they have books, and they have information. But culture to me, Dean, is culture is what happens when no one's looking. It's what happens in your workplace on a early Sunday morning when the bosses aren't around or the supervisor's not around. Culture, is very difficult to define. It's very, it's easy to lose. It's hard to strengthen. But good culture allows supervisors, managers to sleep at night. And bad culture is the stuff, it keeps you awake. I know in my heart of hearts, the crews are doing everything they're supposed to. They're taking care of one another. They're following the safe work practices. They're using all of their personal protective equipment, and they're taking care of one another. I'll give you an example. Culture. I've done a lot of training over the last 20 years across Canada, not just in Canada, but United States. Every electrical worker has a story. What I mean that is during training, I always ask my trades group in the course to say, how many people had electrical shock? Every single electrical worker or somebody who's been in the trade for a long time, they'll put their hand up some way, shape, or form. They've taken some, electrical shock or poke in their career or in their lifetime. And I always follow that question up because, that story they had, I said, listen, what did your supervisor say when you had that electrical shock? And they look at me and they go, what are you talking about? I didn't tell my supervisor. I just, you do one of two things. You either shut power off where you should have done in the first place. You put your rubber gloves on, you put your PPE back on, and you take a different measure, and then nobody learned about those things. So it's one of those things that I learned and started to really lean into when I realized how many people had a story about, they didn't tell anybody. I even have my own story where I shorted out a set of Class 4 rubber gloves. I was installing a set of, we were removing a set of openers on 16,000 volt primaries, 27.6, 16 kV. And I was working with a really tall person in the double bucket, and I was reaching out to take the grip off, and I shorted out a pair of Class 4 rubber gloves. And I caught my elbow on the circuit and took quite a static shock. Now, I'm here today to say, hey, listen, I didn't die from it because in our world, we work on multiple barrier approaches so that if one barrier fails, we always have a secondary. But that electrical shock, or that poke I took, I looked down to the ground and my lead hand was on the ground and he saw what happened. And the journeyman in the bucket beside me saw what happened. And here was the comment from the crew at that job site was basically, bet you won't do that again. And we didn't talk about it. We didn't, stop as a group and say, hey, listen, I was embarrassed. I was flat out embarrassed. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm not a very good lineman if I shorted out my rubber gloves. But you get talking to linemen over the years, and every single lineman have had a story of some way, shape, or form of, getting a close call or a near miss. And the pride in the high voltage trade. Oftentimes you're seen as making a mistake. The culture in the high voltage industry also, you have to give kind of consideration to the what I'll call the inherent culture of the high voltage industry. When we're all buckling down, like if the weather's terrible or a storm's coming in or we're getting extreme weather or even tornadoes or extreme cold or ice storms, the high voltage industry is rubbing their hands together and they're getting ready to go to work. And it's not everybody who has that mindset where you go, I'm going to tackle this and I'm going to go to work in the extreme conditions, where the rest of us are at home and comfortable in our houses and we only become inconvenient when the power's not on. There's a culture and there's a pride and there's a sense of you want to be the person that closes the switch in, that picks up the group of houses. Maybe it's a community, maybe it's a subdivision. In 98, during the ice storm, when you close an air break in and the whole town comes back on power, those pressures sometimes have a personal impact on people to pressure yourself into sometimes maybe, not taking every precaution reasonable or pushing that envelope.
Yeah. We think about things like the fireman.
Yes.
You're in a fire, you're running from the burning house to get out. The
Yep.
fireman calmly walks into the fire to deal with it. When the power's out, systems are down, systems are damaged, we assess, deal with the risks, repair, get it restored, and then in another day, maybe do more than just the Band-Aid we did the day to get the power back on. But the whole goal is to keep the lights on. So in all of this, we want to talk about being human and communicating those events. So how do we get that next mindset to think about what it is we need to deal with?
A phenomenal question, Dean. And one of the things that I'm going to draw a bit of a parallel to is the professional high voltage industry it's a professional sector. It's pays well. There's a lot of structure around it. There's a lot of pride around it. But I'm also involved in professional motorsports. And I draw a comparison between the professional line trade or the professional high voltage industry and the professional motorsport industry. And the reason I want to talk just a little bit about it, the main difference in the high voltage industry and the professional racing industry is professional racing, it's hard to hide a crash. It's hard to hide, broken equipment or any of those things that happen in the pursuit of being better or continuing being better. We don't discipline professional motocross racers or any type of automotive racers when they break equipment. Maybe they get a flat tire. Maybe they tip over or bump into somebody. What happens is at the end of that race, they come back with their team and they have a conversation about what transpired either on the track or in the course of that particular race. They're not measuring how many busted up clutches, how many busted up pieces of equipment. But yet when you draw the parallel back over to the professional line trade, we often feel as high voltage workers that we're not good enough if we do something wrong or if we make a mistake. But the only way you get better is by learning of your incidents and close calls and near misses. And that's no different in the professional racing community as it is in the high voltage sector. Knowing people who have had multiple electrical shocks, that's this thing with electrical hazards is it's different than working at heights. It's different than confined space because electricity you can't see, hear, or smell until you take a major poke. And people who have had electrical shock are flipping a coin because they're introducing current to the body. And that one shock you get, you put your hand back in your pocket, you look around to see if anybody's seen what happened. That happens, and then you go, well, nobody saw that. I'm not going to talk to Dean about it. I'm not going to talk to Andy about it. We kind of bury them, but we learn nothing about them. Whereas breaking down those barriers to be able to talk about close calls and near misses. Yeah, sometimes, the professionals make mistakes, but the only way you're going to get to being a professional is talking through some of the near misses, close calls. That whole parallel between motorsport racing and the high voltage professional sector. I've always looked at them and said, well, how come in the professional motorsports we are open in dialogue? We talk about, the close calls. We talk about, get a flat tire or I've got a bent up a set of handlebars because I've done something wrong. The team owner and the team, they don't stand at the sidelines and they're not holding up a list of all the things that you did wrong. They want to talk through the things that you've done well. We need to learn that the professional electrical sector is, it needs to take some lessons out of some of the other professional industries.
The analogies of looking at what you do well in professional sports. They don't hang a banner that says we had 30 losses last year. They hang a banner if they win the division.
Exactly.
They hang a banner if they win a championship. They hang up, the things that entice people to keep coming. So we have to do more of talking about all the good things in order when we get to the bad things. And the near miss discussion is so critical in going forward. So what is the importance of understanding the environment to not talk about it or learn from it?
It's industry culture. The high voltage sector, whether you're talking to high voltage electrical workers in North America, whether you're talking to them in the United States or in Canada, from province to province, you have to really understand the culture. Every organization has a distinctive culture, and merging of cultures is often a challenge as well. And I talked a little bit about my incident, like shorting out a set of Class 4 rubber gloves. There's a fear of embarrassment. You don't want to be seen as doing things wrong, or the fear of discipline is usually fairly low on the list, because to me, it's more of a fear of being embarrassed or I don't want to be laughed at by my colleagues or my buddies that I work with. And often these incidents go unreported. And in the eyes of the workers, if it's not reported, how do you talk about it? And what do you learn from it? And these are the things, Dean, that to me are critical to talk about, because we'll talk about it a little bit later. But often the high voltage guys, as they get older in life, they reflect back on their careers. So you really got to define. You need to understand the culture, the industry culture, the organization, the trade culture, and all those things.
So talk to us about the notion of going beyond electrical awareness or reporting near-miss activities. What is the issue of, let's call it the pride of the trade, that we need to make a point on?
One of the things that a lot of organizations, and you kind of alluded to it just a few moments ago, we tend to put so much emphasis on I'm going to call them our lagging indicators, the indicators that result in loss. Critical injuries and fatalities in the industry. Everybody knows about them, and everybody wants to talk, through what happened, what transpired. We want to talk about, lost time. We want to talk about medical aids. And Dean, so there's a lot of emphasis put on that. And I like what you say about when you walk through a professional, arena or a professional pits of motorsports, they're not hanging every time somebody had a broken fender or a flat tire. They're not hanging out for people to see all the things that we didn't do well. They're putting up all the things that we did well, and moving the thought process away from the lagging indicators, because that's a negative conversation. And often it's people are looking for somebody to hang a bit of blame on. How do we do better, as opposed to focusing on what I'll call the leading indicators? And this is where we talk about, leading indicators and breaking the barriers down, about talking about near misses, close calls, hazard concerns. There's got to be a belief, that somehow, if I do make a mistake as a professional, it's okay to talk about it. I interact with a lot of professional motorsports, like I said earlier. Nobody's perfect. Even as in my tenure as a tradesperson, I look at all the things that I did well. I'm here today. I've got all my parts with me, but the employers often put a lot of emphasis on the lagging indicator. And talking about near misses and close calls, discussing them, it's an important aspect. And I still struggle in our sector to break down those barriers and break down those walls, because you could jump in a vehicle and go for a drive for a couple hours with a group of trades guys, and you will learn more about what's been happening with that group on a drive, from one work location to another, than you ever will sitting in a safety meeting, because of that, being able to break down those barriers.
When you're talking to the veteran line workers or retired line workers, how does the question come up, what did you learn, come into the conversation?
I actually love talking to retired high voltage electrical workers, whether they're linemen, whether they're, power generation or transmission guys. They have amazing stories. They all have a particular story they want to tell you about. They'll tell you who was a great leader in their industry. They'll tell you who was essentially basically a hard ass on you as you were coming through. But they also have an awful big pride in their career about what they've done and how they've accomplished and what they've done throughout their career. But I always like to lead with this, and I say, listen, would you like your son or your daughter to learn the trade the way you did? And overwhelmingly, most of the retired journeymen go, no, I don't want my son or daughter learning the way I learned. I would not want my son or my daughter shorting out a set of Class 4 rubber gloves or taking a poke here and there just because maybe you learned a bad habit or a bad practice from a journey person who that you felt was a safety leader. And like I said, Dean, they have a lot of stories and they will share openly the good and the bad and the ugly. So I really enjoy that. And they always talk about continual improvement. They talk about what it was like, years ago. Planting poles in the ground and putting structures up in the air hasn't changed a lot. The tools and equipment and machinery has changed, but the humans and the practices are very similar.
I know we've been involved in many things, such as the Electrical Utility Safety Rules, or EUSRs, we know it, Utility Work Protection Code, Trades Training and Developing Standards. And I think back to my brother Wayne and Mark Kellett from K-Line brought up a point at an annual meeting at USA that kind of halted the meeting to get the notion over of we're not going to accept no more injuries. And Ted Vandevis brought forward the notion of we need to look at zero, and the path to zero got created. So, and then eventually the WSIB made it into the provincial mandate of the paths to zero. Are we setting people up for failure with the expectation of zero occurrences? What is zero really?
I actually love this question, and it's a very thought-provoking, because at the time that ZeroQuest was introduced, and I remember working for the Legacy USA, and the whole organization came up with, how do we get to zero injuries, and what are the paths to zero injuries? The problem with zero injuries, and the problem with zero, is we have to also be realistic. We also have to look at, what's achievable. I 100% agree that that's got to be the goal. Is we don't want to hurt the humans. We want the humans to
absolutely
go home at the end of the day. My good friend Bill Sims Jr., he talks about pursuing beyond zero injuries, because often now, if we look at some of the drivers from 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was the WSIB premiums that drove a lot of the relentlessly pursuing zero to lost time and all those components. We get good at, managing claims. We get good at putting people back to work. Maybe they're not 100%, but we congratulate them, getting them back into the workplace. So now we have to look, well, how do we get beyond zero? And getting beyond zero is essentially looking at the pyramid, looking at the incident pyramid, and spending time on the pieces that are not lost time, they're not medical aids, they're not critical injuries. Because if we look at them in the sector, our insurance premiums in the utility sector is actually less expensive than the teaching sector. So we've done an incredible job over 110 years since the rule book had been in place. It's evolving, and it's that continual improvement. So what I like to do is start separating lagging indicators and saying, listen, we've got to, they're important. And a lot of people, we need to know, the damage that happens. We need to know that some of the outcomes, but we need to focus really on the leading indicators. In the incident pyramid, leading indicators are near miss, hazard concern reporting, close calls, near hits. People talk about, well, that nearly missed me. Well, no, it almost hit me type thing. And leading indicators in the workplace, we also need to find people doing a good job. We need to find people talking close calls, following safe work practices, because the reward or the positive reinforcement aspect of finding people doing things right is very rewarding for the professionals. You talk to professional motorsports, when they have a great race, they come off and they're feeling good about themselves. They feel good about their equipment. They feel good about the team. They feel good about their environment. We need to take lessons from the professional, sporting world and apply it into the professional high voltage sector. Reducing the risk factors is talking about the near misses, close calls, how people are working in the field, things like safety talks. Like, we don't celebrate the fact that we do safety talks with crews. We do job planning with crews. We do safety meetings. We do a ton of health and safety training and awareness. We want to make sure that workers are doing everything and then have the tools and the equipment they need to do in the field. The challenge often in boardrooms and sometimes in an organization is, oh my God, we had a lost time, and we didn't manage that claim maybe perfectly, or that person just really didn't feel well the next day to come back to work. And we put a lot of emphasis on what I call those lagging indicators, and it's hard to build that momentum on positive reinforcement. I'll go back to the professional racing. Like if a racer had broke a fender or got a flat tire or a small tip over, damage on the equipment, or even strained her wrist, if the team manager, pulled up a list of all the broken fenders or all the flat tires or all the clutches that went bad or the pains and strains, and you spent all your time focused in on worry about that, you're not going to want to race for that team. You're not going to ride for that team. The same thing happens in the workplace. We've got to really zero in on the things that we do well, find people doing things well, celebrate the aspects that we do very, very well. And you said earlier, and I like this philosophy, like we hang our banners and saying, hey, we have 150 accident-free days in the workplace. And we go, well, how do we change that to a positive? How do we go, well, listen, we have 15, championships, and we've won 15 races, and we've had the fastest lap times. We've got to celebrate the things that we do well. We just finished doing a review of our workplace inspections here at ALECTRA, and we've inspected the workplace almost 5,000 times in 2024 in 9 different locations, diving into the things that we do well and looking at what supervisors and managers to embrace health and safety and having conversations in the field. And conversations are both, every now and again, you're going to have a hard conversation about what's going on. Am I as a supervisor doing what I need to do to set expectations for my crews? Am I as a manager setting expectations for my supervisors? So
yeah, it's about what you're doing well.
Sometimes people make mistakes. Sometimes things are done with malicious intent, but we still have to deal with those things. But for the most part, the humans really, they need to be celebrated on things they do well. Positive reinforcements, that's something that our health and safety team has been working on, finding people doing things well and also bringing things forward, and as opposed to the pizza party for everybody. Positive reinforcement is never a bad time for a great learning opportunity.
I think, from all of what you've just recapped and all the things we've highlighted, all I can say is we have a great opportunity to bring the culture to the next level. We've brought it a long ways from 60, 70 years ago when the fatality rate was 50%.
Yes.
We've brought it to the point where there's 0 fatalities and we're trying to get to a 0 injuries. But this prompts me to think that we need to continue this discussion on standards another day. But anyways, for this show, I want to thank you for being on Powerful Connections. And before we close this episode, give me some closing remarks for people to chew on as they're pondering everything we've listened to.
You and I being in the high voltage sector for, our entire adult careers, there are a ton of resources at our fingertips, and often people, kind of struggle and go, well, I didn't learn that in apprenticeship, or I didn't learn that in the Provincial Safety Association. And I like to kind of tell, in our sector, we have the act and regulations that govern our safe work and the practices that go on the field. We have a provincial rule book that's embedded in regulation that's reviewed every 5 years. It's got a 110-year-old history. It predates that, the act and regulations. We have standards available to, CSA Z460 it's a control of hazardous energy. It's where you find good lockout, tagout protocols. It's a Canadian standard on controlling hazardous energy. There's CSA Z462, which is a phenomenal document with great people, and I always had the honor to be a part of that committee, and still, since 2005 to establish, safe work practices for electrical work. It doesn't define whether you're an electrician or a lineman or a substation. Yeah. It's just about electrical hazards. CSA Z463 is an electrical maintenance standard. So these things are at our fingertips, and lots of resources. And Dean, we can get into it another time. We could probably have a podcast on the history of the rule book and some of the stuff that goes on. Our first rule book in 1914, there were 3 rules that still still in the test of time. And, one of those rules from 1914 said all electrical work had to be done and supervised by competent persons. That hasn't changed. Electrical work had to be done with full-length sleeves extending to the wrists, full-length pants extending to the ankles. And even back in 1914, we had the right to refuse unsafe electrical work. So some of the rules haven't changed, and you and I both know that Ohm's law hasn't changed either, and it's probably not going to change anytime soon.
True.
So I'll wrap up with, I wish for a community for culture, particularly around health and safety. One of the things that I've really tried to ingrain in with my team, particularly here at ALECTRA, and in my career, is I don't look through the lens of a manager. I don't look through the lens of a union. I don't look through the lens of a lineman. I look through the lens of human beings exposed to hazards. And if you can, kind of hang your management hat at the door and hang your worker hat at the door and saying, listen, what's the best for the humans, and how do we make sure that the humans go home at the end of the day? And we need to make sure they're protected. I look back 30 odd years in my career, a little more than 25 in the health and safety industry. And there's still a lot of work to go. And my goal, your goal, Dean, is to give the tools to the next generation to keep doing good work and looking at hazards and making sure that people are doing, going home at the end of the day with a little bit of money in their pocket.
And, in your words, all you want to do is get better.
Yes.
And do better. And this has been a great discussion. Appreciate your insight and thought-provoking ideas, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Dean. This has been a great opportunity, and I look forward to, maybe we can do it again in the future, find some topics, and we can bench race electrical safety.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Andy. In this episode, Andy Kerr raised some great points under the heading of culture in the high-risk sector. The positive reinforcements of the health and safety team is really striving for people to share openly and don't let the great pride of the trade get in the way of great learning opportunities. Andy and I both talked about how do I get better today than I was yesterday. Rainey, what was your takeaways from the discussions with Mr. Kerr?
Well, Dean, I've known Andy for a long time, and he is one of the best in the business in his field of health and safety. Listening to Andy's introduction, the one thing that caught my attention right away was 99% of the time, incidents that happen, humans getting hurt, critical injuries, and fatalities, they're not a rule problem, and they're not a rule book issue. It is human behavior and the stuff that revolves around those things. I know good culture drives good health and safety, and what Andy said was culture is the thing that happens when no one is looking. And I agree with him. You and I both know developing a good culture takes years, and it's very easy to lose. Andy also said almost everyone has a story about a close call, a near miss, or near hit, what they don't want to talk about. What he said is they take a poke. So somebody gets a little shock and they put their hand in their pocket and they look around to see if anyone saw them. It is a culture of pride, so they don't want to talk about it, but then we learn nothing from the incident. However, talking about it could save an injury or even a life somewhere along the way. Humans are something that need to be celebrated on things they do well. We need to talk about near hits, not just so we can reach 0 fatalities in our industry, but to achieve 0 injuries, and many utilities have done that. What we heard in the comparison to the professional motorsport, the discussion of close calls in the professional high voltage sector needs to be done in a positive way and not to cause embarrassment to the person. I think one of the most impactful things that Andy stated was some things stand the test of time. And he went on to say since 1914, electrical rules have said all electrical work had to be done and supervised by competent persons. Workers had the right to refuse unsafe electrical work. Those have been in there since 1914. And then he added, Ohm's law hasn't changed either. Dean, you and I both know, if you forget those first 2 rules, then you'll get introduced to the unforgiving hazard side of Ohm's law and the energy and pack behind electricity.
Thanks, Rainey. The takeaways from our discussion are great culture discusses the mistakes and near hits for learning and not for punishment. Good health and safety is a non-reprimand. Great culture works at health and safety every day. It is not something that happens by itself. Great culture celebrates accomplishments. Great culture does not look through the lens of management, union, or tradesperson. Great culture is looking through the lens of a human exposed to hazards, wanting the humans to go home safe at the end of the day. We can always get better. Look forward to hearing from you after you listen to each episode. I encourage you to subscribe to Powerful Connections wherever you get your podcasts. Share the podcast with those you feel will find it interesting and useful. Connect with me on my website at dgg5advising.com or find me on LinkedIn at Dean G. Gation.